Okay, finishing up chapter 3 of the Tapestry. August was a hot month. Philadelphia heat and humidity brought people out to sit on their stoops and porches or big screened-in verandas, depending on where they lived. Ice cream vendors did a big business from their carts, in spite of the depression. A nickel cone was a big dip and lasted long enough to be worthwhile. Walking down the main street, Germantown Avenue, Fran felt depressed and lonely. He hadn't found anyone who cared much about his discoveries in the Bible, and he was wishing he could find a job for the summer, as well as wondering about the next year. As he walked further and further down in the direction of Lane Junction, he came to a tent pitched on an empty lot on the corner of Ashmead Place. Now, Ashmead Place was going to mean a lot to him in the next few years, because that was to be the street my parents were going to move to when they would leave Canada. But that was in the future, and he had no idea that this corner would be one he would be hastening to impatiently through the next years. Right now, it was the sound of a piano and hymns being sung that piqued his curiosity. What on earth is going on in there, he wondered. Pushing the tent flap open, he walked in to find benches placed in rows, a sawdust aisle between them, a small number of people singing, and a man standing in front leading them. Before long, a sermon followed the lusty gospel hymns, and it poured forth in earnest simplicity, verse after verse of the basic gospel. Fran listened with wonder to the speaking of this man, an Italian-American, who told of his conversion out of crime and drugs and of his being freed not only from his cell 66 in prison, but from his sin. The sermon did not deal with philosophical answers to the questions of life, nor did it point out a line of demarcation between liberalism and true biblical Christianity. But one thing became clear as crystal through the fiery speaking in an Italian accent. This man was talking about the same Christianity Fran had found for himself. This man believed what Fran believed. There were others. It broke out like a blast of a trumpet into Fran's consciousness, and he hurried to the front, up the sawdust trail, as evangelists have called the aisle, in response to the invitation. When the evangelist asked, "Young man, what are you here for, salvation or reconsecration?" Fran was confused and didn't know how to explain the wonder of what he was declaring, as he had come to take the place among the believers. As the evangelist turned away, probably thinking this young man was a bit foolish, Fran went out into the night with a singing heart, with a formulated decision as to how he would then live. Okay, so what y'all may or may not know is probably Francis Schaeffer's most famous book is How Should We Then Live? So it's a reoccurring theme that he would ask, how should he then live?
Great.
Let's see. Fran went out tonight with a singing heart, with a formulated decision as to how he would then live. If the curtain into the future could have been pulled back, not only would Fran have caught a glimpse of Ashmead Place as a locality where he would one day make another decision, asking me to marry him, but he would also have been able to stand amazed that at a more distant date, in some 45 years, the young evangelist's son and his own son would meet to make a film together called How Should We Then Live? You see, the evangelist was Anthony Zioli, and his son was to be Billy Zioli. However, the Lord does not pull curtains back, and we each need to go on one step into the next hour. Fran's next hour that night was spent in rushing home and writing down in his diary, which is yellowed but still readable beside me right now, August 19th, 1930, tent meeting. Anthony Zioli. Have decided to give my whole life to Christ unconditionally. You see, his decision that night was a basic one of how he intended to live from that time on. He felt if this, which he had previously discovered, was indeed the truth, then he wanted to give his life to making that truth known. Dramatic? It is only God who writes this kind of script. Edith writes kind of in a cheeky way, doesn't she?
Yeah.
I think so too. Fran's diary notes that he went back to the tent meetings to hear Zeoli again on August 22nd. Then he carefully puts down the fact that he cursed twice on August 23rd, evidently resolving from then on that he will keep a check on himself, asking God to help him break this habit. August 26th, went to the tent meeting again and took some others along. It didn't take long for him to want other people to hear this very different kind of preaching. How does the Lord lead? Is there a standard formula identical for each person, a key that opens an easy way of finding out just what to do? It cannot be said too many times. We are individuals, and our God is a person who deals with us personally. The succession of things that took place in the next year was not of things that fall into a category of how to know the Lord's will is changing the direction of your life, period. Nevertheless, it was a year filled with struggle and agony, along with an unmistakable leading of the Lord. God is very gentle with his children as they ask with a measure of honesty and desire to do his will. Remember now that Fran's father wanted him to work with his hands, and that he felt all ministers were drones who did not work, but were parasites of some kind. Remember that both his parents wanted him not to go to college, but to go on with mechanical engineering in Drexel Institute, a path chosen in his very studies for the past 6 years. The easiest way to relive some of that year with Fran is to read bits of his diary. September 2nd, this is exactly 2 weeks after his first time in the tent meeting and his decision that night. Registered at Drexel Institute for night school in mechanical engineering. September 3rd, decided all truth is from the Bible. September 14th, talked with Mr. Moore and Mr. Sam Osborne about Hampton-Sydney College. Mr. Moore was the Sunday school teacher. Mr. Osborne was the headmaster of Germantown Academy and a Hampton-Sydney alumnus himself. He was eager to have Fran go to his old school and suggested it as a preparation for theological school later on. Evidently, Fran had sought these two men, both members of the First Presbyterian Church, for advice about education, if indeed he were to make a change in order to prepare to use his life to make truth known. It is not yet a month since the tent meeting, yet a practical battle is now raging inside, whether to please parents and go on in engineering, or to turn toward an academic preparation which had now become a burning in his bones. September 15th, started night school at Drexel. September 25th, went to RCA Victor, stood in a long line, got job for 32 cents an hour, worked at Victor's. Rough place, but hope with God's help to affect the environment rather than sinking to its level. September 27th, hope I may please God in my use of leisure time. Just when this leisure time existed is not clear, as he had to get up at 5 a.m. to get out in time for an early trolley car to the river, then cross on a ferry to Camden and put in a full day's work at the RCA factory. He would have supper at night in the Horn and Hard Arts cafeteria. In a few years, I was to experience the blast of aroma that hits the nostrils there, the stewed tomato with a bit of onion and green peppers cooked in it, the fresh pumpkin pies with one dark spot slightly burned on purpose to give it the extra homemade look, and the mashed potatoes and gravy that accompanied the slab of slightly gray beef. For that was where I stopped for lunch day after day, when Fran was in the hospital for an appendectomy and we were in seminary and I was pregnant. But I need to tell it all in proper order. After supper, he went directly to Drexel for a full evening course and got home late at night to study at the kitchen table. September 29th, worked, school at night, supper at Horn and Hardin's. Doesn't sound exciting, but it is, for I feel my new motto is being helped by God. October 7th, someone stole my coat and my lunch at work. October 8th, Sam Chestnut asked if I would come and drive the grocery truck for deliveries. October 11th, quit Victor's after the strike and worked at Chestnut's grocery. An explanation is needed here. The work at RCA Victor was assembly line work, and Fran was just a busboy. Women worked on the belts, doing their individual thing to the parts as they passed them. In that one area of the enormous barn-like room, with all the noise and confusion of the machinery, there were 5 drill presses feeding parts of amplification units for assembly by the women. 5 men worked the drill presses, and some days a special thing happened. At about half an hour before closing time, a big boss, with the always present cigar hanging out of the corner of his mouth, would come in waving a fistful of $5 bills. There were only 5 fives, and the promise of encouragement he shouted to the 5 men ran like this: "If you guys at the presses will turn out more parts, double it in the next half hour, there'll be a $5 for each of you." Faster and faster the drill presses would run, and in a frenzy the conveyor belt would be supplied with double work for the women. No extra money for the women, only extra work at the moment. They were ready to drop with fatigue. By the end of the half hour, some would be weeping, but a person couldn't quit in the days of the Depression, because there was always someone to take your job if you dropped out. On this particular day in early October, one woman got to a point of rebellion at the unfairness and stood up yelling, "Strike! Strike!" Gradually, a few others took their hands away from the frantic work and joined in the same shout. Some began to pull others up by their hair. Fran, at that point, jumped up on a counter and yelled in his loudest voice, "Strike! Strike!" And almost every woman stood up and let the parts go sliding by unfinished. As Fran looks back at that moment and remembers the emotion and indignation within him, he realizes that at that point of history, under different circumstances, he could easily have gone on to become a labor organizer. As it was, we see by his diary that an amazing offer came when offers were not being made for jobs. For him to work with the father of a school friend, and he took a place delivering groceries for the next months. Of course, choice was involved. Of course, Fran was the one who said yes to that change that particular day. But looking back, the wonder of it is the realization that God was answering prayer for direction, not with big supernatural signs, but quiet and definite leading. November 29th, swore once today. He's trying not to cuss anymore. December 1st, took exam at Drexel on steam power. December 5th, got a B in algebra at Drexel. Sounds like your chagrin. December 10th, prayed with Sam Chestnut today. Now my mind is fully made up. I shall give my life for God's service. It is significant that he is personally talking about Christianity and praying with Sam now quite naturally. December 11th, had dinner at Dr. Finney's apartment. He was the assistant pastor. He's very famous, by the way. Have fully made up my mind to prepare for the ministry. In that time, the term the ministry did not carry as wide a meaning as today, and it designated preparing to be a minister or a pastor. December 13th, may I always be in God's keeping, especially in social functions. Have found real joy of living and trying to serve God and others. December 14th, Mother and Dad still hostile to my plan. I hope guidance comes strongly and surely. December 15th, worried all day over Mother and Dad's not being back of me for my life's work. Decided to leave all to God. December 16th, talked to Dad alone. He said to go ahead and that Mother would get over it. December 31st, spent this New Year's Eve day taking stock till midnight at Sam Chestnut's grocery store. Another year gone. May all the future years bring as much development as this one. January 1st, 1931. Hey, babe. New Year's Day. May this year bring joy to the world and guidance to me. January 30, 19th birthday. Switched today from Drexel to Central High School, evening school. Taking Latin and German, now definitely preparing for Hampton-Sydney College, as per arrangement by Sam Osborne, also having extra tutoring in German, still working in grocery store. February 8th. Hey, there's your salad over there.
I wanted to listen.
Read Grace Livingston Hill's The Witness, and it shook me to the core. Remember that Fran's own Bible reading, the tent meetings, and the continued preaching at his church were all he'd ever had thus far. The notations for the rest of that spring and summer were in the same direction. Hard work in German and Latin brought marks in the 90s, and by the end of summer 1931, he was all set for Hampton-Sydney College. His acceptance had come through, but there was no one at home to share his excitement. No brothers and sisters, no cousins, no close friends. He had dated a girl out at Beaver College for a time, but there had been no great exchange of ideas in the areas that interested him most. Sam Chestnut was the only one with whom he could pray. At home, the idea of his leaving for college was ignored. Early in September, the day came when packing for college could no longer be put off. Fran had taken a wooden box his father brought home one day, strongly made to hold 2 office typewriters, and had put it on newspapers in the cellar and painted it a battleship gray with a half can of paint left over from painting the kitchen floor. No new clothes had been provided, no sports equipment, no matched towels and sheets and pillowcases. A grim-faced mother turned her back as if no packing were going on. Fran had no idea how he was going to pay for college. In those days, that total amounted to about $600 a year. But he started to pack. As he folded his clothing from his bureau drawers and took things from his cupboard, he decided to wear his one suit with long trousers and pack his gray tweed knickers. Yes, those Swiss alpine climbing or cross-country skiing knickers, which he feels so comfortable in now, were not anything he knew about. He had never felt a need to change from the knickers of his high school days to become more sophisticated. There were a bathing suit, a raincoat, and gym clothes, and then his mother, with tightly pressed lips and no comment, threw a few old towels and a cake of soap on top. With his Bible, a few books, toothbrush, and shaving brush and soap, along with the razor and blades, the box was ready for its top. In Pop's nail and screw box, neatly in categories, Fran found 4 big long screws and proceeded to carefully screw the top down at the 4 corners. College packing was finished. Before he went to bed, Pop said, "Get up in time to see me before I go to work, 5:30. When Fran came down in the morning, Pop was standing by the front door. Turning to give Fran a long, hard look, he said, "I don't want a son who is a minister, and I don't want you to go." It was the end of his dreams for his son, dreams of a son who would work with his hands and be a good, honest worker, dreams of his son who might be a little farther along in education, but who would continue to work around him and maybe live on the same street. Dreams of a son he would be proud of by his standards were being destroyed by a harsh daylight of reality. How many fathers and mothers have stood by a door like that one, figuratively if not literally, and said, "I don't want a son whose life is going to be made up of putting God first. I don't want a son or daughter whose ambition for blank," and a variety of things would be inserted, fame, power, success, affluence, leadership, is being put aside for anything so ridiculous as following God. I don't want a religious son, or I don't want a religious daughter. So very, very many people can identify with Fran in that moment, as they also have stood one by one with a father or mother or both confronting them with a choice. Who are you going to choose to follow? We can go back and place a picture of Joshua as a kind of transparency on top of this scene. Whom will you serve? Go back and read Joshua 24:14-15. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Century after century, sons and daughters have stood with 2 ways before them, making a choice that might seem too trivial to parallel Joshua's plea for choice, but which is really a central choice. There comes a time, a moment, a choice that is stripped of all other factors and becomes a basic thing of truly putting the Lord first. It isn't recognized as central sometimes, and often people think that they can make the choice later on, not recognizing how much more difficult that is going to be. Century after century, we could follow the stories of the Calvins and Luthers, of the prisoners of Chillon and others, finding places where they made central choices that turned the direction of not only their own lives, but the lives of many, many other people. So very often when we stand in the place of Joshua, there is no troop of people in sight. Our declaration, "As for me and my house," seems a feeble little commitment because there is no one else in sight. Yet a choice is being made in a very real way for all the unborn sons and daughters of another generation. Will the choice to serve the Lord and to obey Him first of all push away a mother and father eventually? I believe the answer is no. It will not make it harder eventually for them to come to truth. But the mother and father are not all of our household there are to consider. Whether we are to have physical children and grandchildren or not, there are to be spiritual children and grandchildren to be considered. The choice we stand and make in early daylight or twilight with no one watching is not unwatched at all, but eagerly viewed, I believe, by angels and demons who know that our choice is going to have a tremendous effect on the tapestry. In the dim light of 5:30 a.m., the milkmen were not yet rattling their bottles in the baskets, and silence stood like a pillar between Fran and his father, an agony of silence. Then Fran asked in a strained voice, "Pop, give me a few minutes to go down in the cellar and pray." In a fear of uncertainty as to what to do, he went down and wept hot tears of sorrow for his father. He knew there was a choice that must be made in minutes, and he wanted to make it exactly as God would have him make it, but how to know what that will of God was. In an act of desperate and simple faith, he did what he wouldn't advise anyone else to do, but what he felt was the only right thing for him to do then. He prayed. If anyone ever prayed sincerely, he did then. "Oh, please, God, show me." Then he took out a coin. "Heads, I'll go in spite of Dad's desires," and he tossed it. It was heads. Still weeping, he cried out, "God, be patient with me. If it comes up tails this time, I'll go." He flipped it again, and it was tails. A third time he pleaded, "Once more, God, I don't want to make a mistake with Dad upstairs. Please now, let it be heads up again." And it was heads. So he went upstairs and walked to his dad and said, "Dad, I've got to go." His dad looked hard at him, then went out to slam the door. But just before the door hit the frame, his voice came through, "I'll pay for this first half year." It was many years later that Pop became a Christian, but Fran thinks this moment was the basis of his salvation. Full of a mixture of emotions, Fran went up to his room to get last-minute things ready, and what hit his eyes was a text he'd stuck up on his wall some time before. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." It seemed an added underlining of his choice. Driving his own car, with a gray box in the back, and accompanied by Charlie Hoffman, a family friend, to drive the car back and put it away for the school term, Fran was soon putting miles between himself and Philadelphia on his first trip to Hampton-Sydney, Virginia. When Fran arrived at Hampton-Sydney, the first person he met was Greek Wilson, who was to be his Greek professor, and in today's language, the vibes were bad. This professor was assigning dorm rooms and noticing that Fran had stated that he was a pre-ministerial student, put him on Fourth Passage of Cushing Hall. Now, this Fourth Passage was a place of sophisticated fellows who would be so antagonistic toward ministerial students that he would be sure to have a hard time. It didn't take long for Fran to know he was being looked at as an alien. He was a northerner in a place full of southern aristocrats, so he was the Yankee, and having given his name as Schaeffer from Philly, he ended up being nicknamed Philly, which lasted through the 4 years. His gray box looked as out of place as it could look among the shiny trunks and matched luggage, and his own clothing was about as strange among the white flannels, blazers, and brown and white shoes of the self-assured young men, many of whom were following their fathers in this school that had been started in 1776. Where was the excitement of arrival at the goal? How could scorn and antagonism be an atmosphere for a new life of study and preparation on the background of the choice so recently made? Fran lugged his gray box up the stairway of an incredibly beaten-up building. Outside, the dorm buildings fit in perfectly with the marvelous red brick, white-columned Southern architecture, beautiful in the quiet setting of clipped lawns, woods inching up to the campus, wonderful rambling fences, autumn roses and red-berried shrubs. But inside, the dorms were the domain of the students, where rooms were never repainted, and mice could be shot with 22 rifles as an evening's pastime. As a matter of principle, professors never entered the building. In a later chapter, we'll come back to life on the fourth passage and to the 4 years of college, which are now history. But that day, it was all an unknown future, and Fran entered his room with one big determination, that he was going to make it here with God's help and have a place to respect before he graduated. And that's the end of chapter 3.
I liked it.